from your article in Foreign Affairs, China now has the largest navy in the world. The growth in China's nuclear arsenal is also alarming. This comes against the backdrop of an arms race in technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, synthetic biology, robotics, and others. In the United States, the supply chain for everything from pharmacological inputs to rare earth minerals runs through China, and then there is Taiwan, close quote. Here's the threshold question. In a way, it's the theme of our whole conversation today. Are we up for this?
We have to be up for it. First of all, we have to recognize that it didn't happen by accident. We actually had a narrative, a belief in integrating China fully into the international economy. When Deng Xiaoping decided to take China out of isolation, we faced a choice. Were we going to try to isolate 1.4 billion people with a growing economy, or would it be better to have them fully integrated? And that integration created exactly some of the points that you've just made, the supply chains that ran through China because it was more efficient, not worrying terribly much about whether or not you were going to get rare earth minerals from China. China was the place to manufacture. It was the place to assemble. There was so much that was to be beneficial about China's integration into the international system.
Beneficial for us.
Beneficial for us. Right. Well, beneficial for the world economy. And in fact, China did contribute to growth. It was very important. But something happened, which is that I'm not much for the great man power, great man theory of history, but Xi Jinping's regime has been different than the regimes before it. You know, we always said, Peter, you cannot have both economic liberalization and political control. Right. And for a while, China was moving to private enterprise, the big companies like Alibaba and Tencent, and you were manufacturing there. It seemed to be working. And then Xi Jinping comes in and he says, thank you very much, I think I'll take political control. And now it's a very different China. And so the recognition that all of the investment that we were putting in through venture capital and through U.S. investment into Chinese technology, were we really doing that so that that technology and what China itself called civil military fusion, so that that technology could be handed to the People's Liberation Army so that they could force us out of the Indo-Pacific with claims in the South China Sea, claims against our allies like Japan and the Philippines? That was the realization that this has somehow, this bet that we made on integrating a country that had a fundamentally different social and political system, but was prepared to play the capitalism game, that maybe that bet hadn't paid off just as we had expected. It's come proper.
Could I dwell on that bet for a moment? Yeah. Because I think every time I ask a question, of course, feel free to correct the question if you want to. But it seems to me that understanding what went wrong is important in understanding what we face now. Okay, so, I mean, as way far back as the Reagan days, I was in the Reagan White House, we had great hopes that China would follow, exactly as you said, this basic pattern. First, you get economic growth, and then as your people get richer, they will begin to push for political freedom. And by the way, it happened in South Korea, and it happened in Taiwan. This was not a crazy idea. Our late Hoover colleague, Harry Rowan, writing in 1996, quote, when will China become a democracy? The answer is around the year 2015. Yeah. And nobody laughed at that when Harry published it in 1996. Yeah. Okay, it didn't happen. Is it the case that it didn't happen? I'll put this crudely, but is it the case that it didn't happen because they're communist? The South Koreans aren't. The Taiwanese are not. As you know, our Hoover colleague, Stephen Kotkin, if you ask him what's the signal finding of a lifetime that you, Stephen, have spent in the Soviet archives, if you could reduce it to a sentence, and he always answers, they were communists. They really believed it, and that meant they had permanent aims against us. Is it because the Chinese are communist, or because we got stuck with this unusual man, Xi Jinping? And if the former is the case, that's one kind of problem. And if the latter is the case, we can outweigh him. Maybe. So you see the difference in those questions,
yes, I do.
right?
And I want to come back to the point of can we outweigh him?
Yes,
because, first of all,
that would be the easiest thing to do.
I would be the first to say, having studied some communist regimes myself, yes, it was in part because they were communists.
Okay.
Right. But it was also because this particular man had a view that communism couldn't evolve. Communism had to remain the same. You had to have absolute control of the Communist Party. He even didn't allow it to evolve in ways that his predecessors had. Remember, one of the problems for authoritarian regimes is that they don't change power peacefully.
Right.
They have too many presidents for life. The Chinese Communist Party had kind of fixed that problem. They had term limits. You got 2 terms. They had age limits. They had a kind of collective leadership where you had a premier who did things about the economy, think Zhuangzi, and then the president did everything else. But the economy could kind of, on its own dynamic, on its own logic, move toward more private enterprise, less state-owned enterprises. China was leading the world in online educational startups, leading the world. They just shut them down because they couldn't control them. So he was prepared to say it has to be absolute Communist Party control. And I do think that put us on a different pathway than had this evolution taken place. But I would be the first to say maybe he was right. Because once you start to get economic liberalization, once people start to expect something different, Hu Jintao told us once, you know, we need courts because people have to be able to go and make a claim for the land that was expropriated by a party official. And I thought, you know, that's called an independent judiciary. That's not going to work so well with total control. So Xi Jinping maybe read it right. Communism is a very fragile system.
And he's saying, and Gorbachev read it wrong.
And Gorbachev read it wrong. He believed, he was a kind of true believer. I knew Gorbachev pretty well. He really did believe that if you took away the lies, if you took away the coercion, people would kind of naturally become good Soviet citizens. What he didn't realize is that communism is, in fact, propped up by lies and by coercion. And once you start to pull those pillars, it's going to collapse.
Once the fear is gone, it's over.
Once fear is gone, it's over. And so maybe Xi Jinping was right, but that meant that our bet about a country that, by the way, the second largest economy in the world, is now not a democracy. When Ronald Reagan, when you would have been in the White House, when Ronald Reagan and George Shultz started the G7,
right,
the largest economies in the world, they were all democracies. And so this question of whether capitalism can really coexist with communism, I think the answer that we're getting is no, that it can't. It was probably, from my point of view, the right bet, because what else were you going to do? But there were elements, you ask how did we get here, there were elements that we didn't keep our eye on the ball. So how could it be, Peter, that semiconductors, an industry created in the United States of America by people like Intel.
Single-digit miles from where we sit.
Right. How could it be that the high end of that somehow ends up in Taiwan, which is vulnerable to China? How could it be that battery technology, which we invented, once dominated, China now dominates? And you see time and time again that maybe too great of an integration was the problem. Not some integration, but recognizing that this was a very different entity with a Communist Party at its head.
One more note about China, and that, of course, is Taiwan. Again, from your article in Foreign Affairs. In Washington, the discussion concerns how to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. But Beijing could blockade the island, or it could seize small, uninhabited Taiwanese islands, or it could cut underwater cables, or launch large-scale cyber attacks. So we have, again, the Cold War versus the present moment and the difference in the nature of the threats. During the Cold War, we looked at Europe, and the whole game, for whatever it was, 4.5 decades, was to prevent the Soviets from invading Western Europe through the Fulda Gap.
Right.
They weren't going to cut the cables. That was it. We'd put up tanks, seal up the... Okay. This the defense of Taiwan will require just as much cunning and determination and ceaseless attention on our part as the Chinese are willing to devote to it, and that seems to be essentially infinite attention and care and pains and imagination. Yeah. Again, as it currently configured, are the Pentagon and the State Department up for this? Just managing that one point of contact.
One point of contact, and we'll come to the problem of overreach, the fact that we have so many of these,
yes.
Right? But let me just say a word about Taiwan. One of the things that's been concerning to me, and it's something we've been trying to do something about at the Hoover Institution, is that it's almost as if the thinking in the Pentagon and in Washington is just such blunt thinking. It's going to be an amphibious landing on Taiwan. The military people will tell you that looks like D-Day times 100.
Right.
China has many, many other options vis-a-vis Taiwan because they don't have to occupy Taiwan. They just have to change the politics in Taiwan till it looks like Hong Kong. And so that, everybody talked about one country, two systems when Hong Kong was given back to China by the British. Well, it became one country, one system. And so what the Chinese would do, I think, for Taiwan is to try to put so much pressure that you have a very pro-Chinese government in Taiwan, and then just slowly but surely it erodes Chinese independence, or Taiwan's independence.
Again, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but my observation on Hong Kong, a few 100,000 people left when the Chinese got rough on Hong Kong. Right. But the business establishment, as far as I can count it, I'm not an expert, you are. Jimmy Lai is in prison, and Martin Lee is under house arrest. That is two members of the Hong Kong business establishment that stood up to Beijing, and everybody else, in effect, cut a deal. So
for now.
Well, so
yes.
why the Chinese say, look, we did it in Hong Kong. Yeah. These people in Taiwan are business people. They'll come to an accommodation once we tighten up the situation. Isn't that a reasonable fear?
Well,
or is there a difference somehow?
I think there is a difference.
Okay.
And I think Hong Kong was always special in some way. And I don't know that there was a Hong Kong identity in the way that there's a Taiwan identity. They did a poll not too long ago, and 70% of Taiwanese do not think of themselves as Chinese. They think of themselves as Taiwanese.
Okay, that's a very basic fact.
And that's a very different way of relating to the mainland. But the mainland may intend to test that proposition. And what I think we have to do is to figure out how we deter the all-out military attack, but how we also respond when you have something like the exercises that China has just been carrying out around Taiwan because they don't like what the president of Taiwan said. We saw it when Nancy Pelosi made her visit there, kind of denial exercises, quarantine. We just need to expand our thinking about what we might be facing, because at some point, if those kinds of tactics are employed, where do we respond? When do we respond? It becomes kind of salami tactics, and that's what I worry about more with Taiwan.